Welcome to the Columbia City Christian Church's YouTube channel. We're really glad to have you here today. My name is Chapin, and I will be teaching the message today. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's been an awesome week in many ways. Like, decent weather, not silly cold, but enough to do stuff, which has been nice. It's been a bit of a blessing, I think. Though, I will be glad to have some dryness. So you'll have to forgive me. This could be a short sermon. It could be a terrible sermon. I was up until 4 a.m. last night finishing it. The hardest part of my job is organizing my thoughts, which is usually when I'm making my slides. So if it seems a little disjointed, you know why. So I titled today's sermon, When Man Puts God on Trial, which I feel like is something that's kind of universally applicable. I feel like we all have done it probably once or twice in our life, whether before coming to faith or still, struggling with faith and trying to learn more about God and getting closer to God. There was a movie, you guys might have seen it, called The Shack, or if you read the book, even better, because it was better as a book. But there was a scene where the main character is being put on trial. Well, not in the literal sense, but he's being put in the throne seat and asked to choose between his children to condemn one to hell and save the other. And it kind of just shows the heart of God, but in many ways it also shows how we oftentimes want to put ourselves in that seat, not realizing that the heavy is the head that wears the crown. And we like to judge God based upon the worst of us, even though he's not the one who inspired that. So these verses that I'll be covering today are going to be kind of heavy, but also kind of universally practical, things that we've probably been asked by non-believers or maybe other believers that are still learning about God. Maybe it's questions that we ourselves have asked, but I think this is going to be kind of one of the heavier turning points of Romans for us. So, my thought from above, it shows up way better over there. Is Man is Condemned to be Free by Jean-Paul. I'm not French, so I'm not even going to bother with trying to pronounce that last name. So Jean-Paul was a French philosopher. He was a Marxist. He was one of the earliest philosophers that kind of discussed the idea of existentialism, the idea of contemplating life and existence and the things beyond our normal lives. He lived in the early part of the 20th century. And the reason why I chose this particular quote over the many that I kind of looked at, I'm trying to remember, Cerebus was another one that I had considered. He's famously quoted, pretty much the one quote that we've all probably heard from secular people, which is, if God is all powerful and if God is all loving, how can we have evil in the world ultimately? But I feel like this one was probably the better of the two, considering what we're going to be going over. There have been many points in my life that I have asked a similar question, which is, why couldn't I just be a robot? Why couldn't I be like the trees and just have programming built into me and do the will of God, right? Because, I want to please God so much. I want to show him my love. And I struggle with it, as all humans do, because sin exists in this world. It's pervasive. And we struggle with doing the things that we want to do, which is another thing that Paul has said in the past, obviously. But the trees don't struggle to grow. The trees don't struggle to produce seed, to wither in the fall and come back in the spring. They do exactly as God intended them to do. They live perfectly in the will of God. But they can no more love God than a rock. We talk about ain't no rock, right? Yes, they will cry out because God's glory has to be declared. It is impossible for it to not be declared. Whether that is the world around us will declare it and cry out to God, or whether it's us. We have the distinct pleasure of being able to do that. We have the mouths to glorify God. We have the heart to glorify God, so all we have to do is do that. So I find it fascinating because in many ways, I do often feel that man is condemned to be free. And freedom can oftentimes be shackles that we were released from by Jesus. He talks about his easy yoke. And I think this is kind of that like mental image and embodiment. We will be covering Romans 9:19 through 29, but I want to do a kind of a small, real quick recap, because I think everything leading up to this point from Romans 1 to where we're at kind of is pertinent. This, like I said, this is kind of a turning point in Romans, I think. So some of the things that Paul has kind of discussed up until this point is humanity's sinfulness, salvation by grace through faith, life in the Spirit, justification apart from works, the security of believers in Christ, okay? So all these things are kind of geared a little bit more towards the Gentiles. There's definitely parts where we were discussing things that Paul was telling the Jews, but it's the understanding of how Jesus changed everything. And yet, we're about to get into some kind of heavy or difficult questions to answer or even really ponder that kind of come both from the Jewish mindset, but also the Gentile mindset. Because let's be honest, if you had been treated as other your entire existence, all of your bloodline has been treated as other, you might be a little apprehensive to believe in a God that seemingly disregarded you. So we'll definitely get into those kind of questions and hopefully, maybe not necessarily answers. I don't know that I would say that I'm that wise or smart, but we will definitely postulate on them. But another important thing to kind of consider specifically with Romans 9 is, if you recall, when Mike was covering it, it starts with Paul in grief. He was heartbroken. He said that he would forsake his own life. He would take condemnation and damnation for the sake of his brother, to be cursed by Jesus so that his fellow Jews could be saved. That's a pretty tall stack of things to do, I would say. I mean, there's only been one person that's ever been able to accomplish it, and that was Jesus. But I feel like, to some degree, we've probably also had those thoughts. We've known people that may not be believers, that our heart aches because they are not believers, and we thought to ourselves, I would give everything for them to be with me in heaven, right? Even if that means I have to sacrifice my salvation. I myself have considered the idea of like, I would have loved to take the place of Jesus. Not because I think I'm capable, but because it breaks my heart to realize what we had to put him through. And I think that is the heart that Paul has going into Romans 9. And then he asks all these really difficult questions kind of in the middle / towards the end. So I want to read verse 18 just so we know what the first question, because Paul just jumps right into it with these verses, is kind of in relation to, so that we have that context. So verse 18, so then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. And then if we go into verse 19, okay, yeah, I'm still wonky over here. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? That's a pretty big question. That's a pretty heavy question when you think about it, because you're literally questioning the Creator. You're questioning the sovereignty of the Creator, because you're saying like, oh, okay, well, if he's going to harden who he's going to harden, if he's going to have mercy on who he's going to have mercy on, then what does it matter what I do? He's already made up his mind what he's going to do in my life, right? We talk about predestination. We've talked about it already in Romans. But I don't know that predestination is the right way to look at it. And we'll get deeper into that as we go through these verses, but these are some pretty difficult questions to get over, especially as a non-Christian, especially as a person who doesn't have a good Christian influence, somebody that might be able to guide them through these questions. Another way of rewording this, which has probably been asked, is if God is sovereign over all things, how can humans be blamed? Right? And this is a deep and recurring theological question that has pretty much existed since Jesus was on this earth, because it is incomprehensible to us, the idea that a person's name could be in the book of life before they were ever born. We talk about how a person was stitched together in their mother's womb, how God knew you before you were born, which means he knew exactly what you were going to do. And this, yet again, going back to the being condemned to free will. So it's definitely something that kind of tears at all of us, I think, because it is a conflict in our own minds because we cannot justify the two things. We can't justify the fact that we have free will, but some of us are destined for destruction, right? But we'll also go into examples of that as well. Verse 20, but who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Okay, I thought I'd be clever, and I brought a little illustration. So one of my many random skills, I don't know if you guys knew this about me, is I'm actually pretty good at origami, right? So I've made this little crane. Well, not so little. I've made bigger, though. Do I have the right, since I created this, to destroy it? Do I have the right to glorify it? Do I have the right to mold it into something completely different? Could I take it apart and put it back together as a box, a balloon? Of course I could, right? I made it. It's mine. Now, the interesting thing about that is, I can also do this. It was pretty, right? Like, it took skill and time to craft. That wasn't just happened. It didn't just happen. I didn't pull it out of thin air, right? There was some value in it to some people. I've made thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of these in my lifetime. It is no more difficult for me to make this than any other origami that I've practiced over the years. But the interesting thing about that, the kind of dual metaphor to that, right? So we're talking about the molder and the mold, but as we'll get into this next verse, I designed that for destruction so that God can be honored. Because I'm willing to bet you were all paying attention when I smashed it, or at least immediately thereafter when you heard the smash. And I think that's interesting because nobody has a problem with the fact that I just smashed that. It's mine. I created it. I have complete sovereignty over it. We are the same to God. We are nothing more than dirt, put together and then given life. We will return to dirt, as we're told. But yet we struggle with the idea of submitting to the supreme deity of the universe. And I love using that word because it's fancy. It's a lot of 10-cent words in there. But it illustrates a point, right? If you have supreme deity of the universe, there's nothing that transpires without your knowledge. There's nothing that transpires that you do not allow. And that's an amazing thing to think about. It's both dually terrifying and amazing because it's amazing in the sense that God has given us free will. We can literally do whatever we want. We've created nuclear bombs, which are terrible. Devastation. We also use the same materials to create nuclear reactors, which have provided electricity to millions. That's amazing. God has allowed us to do that. He's also allowed us to do absolutely horrific sins. Verse 21, has the potter no right over the clay, to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? Okay, yet again, using this illustration to glorify God, to get the attention to illustrate the point, right? This was my dishonorable use thing, which we'll go into even deeper as we go. But I love the illustration here because this is a repeated theme. We've seen this in the past. We've seen it in, I think, Jeremiah 19, if memory serves, and many other verses where it talks about God being the potter and us being the clay. The thing is, if you've ever gone into your backyard or you've ever dug in Indiana, very rarely do you ever reach pure clay that you could throw immediately. It requires some working. It requires refining, which we've also discussed. You gonna fix me? Cool. And then it has to then be molded. And the wonderful thing about it is, until you've been put in the kiln, hell, you are remoldable. Until you've been fired, you can be put in water and then remolded. That is the whole cycle of the Christian life. We were one thing, and then through God and through our desire to get closer to Him, He has then put us back into the water, baptism, and He has molded us into something new. And it's a continual process. It's a wonderful thing. Now, the only time that you truly become a dishonorable vessel is if you never allow yourself to be remolded. And then you will eventually be put in the kiln, and you will be made hard, which, yet again, beautiful illustration for this entire set of verses. Paul's amazing like that. I wish I had half the intelligence that man had. What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? Now, this is the interesting thing. So we've been talking about the idea of like the potter and molding the clay, which I would say to us is it's intentionality, right? And it would be easy for a non-Christian to say, well, kind of going back to the first couple questions, like why would God make me this way? Why would God do this? But in that question, you're forgetting one crucial element, which is the free will part of it. If we look back to Pharaoh, we look back to Exodus, Pharaoh hardens his own heart like 8 or 9 times before God steps in. That's hugely important. And look how it transpired. At any point in that journey up until the last thing, which if he had changed his mind earlier, it would have never reached the last hardening where God hardened his heart. He could have said, I don't want the smoke. God, you take them. And it'd have been done. And the interesting thing is due to God's sovereignty and due to his power, it would have accomplished the same thing, except it may have saved so many more. But Pharaoh was unwilling to budge. He hardened his own heart. And then when God finally hardened his heart, it led to his literal destruction. God doesn't just craft us so that we are perfect. It is a refinement process. And sometimes the vessel is damaged on creation, not because of his intentionality, but because we are born and we exist in a world that is saturated in sin. It affects everything. It is pervasive. I could do an entire sermon on the idea of sin. In fact, I think I might have. But it's so pervasive that we think to ourselves like, well, I was born gay, or I was born XYZ. But that's kind of a silly argument, especially when you think about the concept of Pharaoh, because, well, I was born into this rich family. I was born with authority and power and everything. But you always have a choice. I mean, if you're born heterosexual, or if you're born with a mental disorder, are you choosing to lean into sin, living a promiscuous life, or being slothful, or whatever the case may be, because it's easy, because it's what's normal, it's natural, it comes easy. We all have our cross to bear. Or are you fighting it every single day? That's where the free will comes in. That's the thing that we oftentimes don't get to in the sequence of questions that Paul is asking, because we want to ask the hard questions of like, well, how could God allow this? How can God make me this way? Well, you were designed as a vessel for wrath. But the awesome thing is the very next part. But another thing I want to point out before we move on, though, is that really, really powerful word there, patience. We think that, well, especially Old Testament, we think of God as this wrathful being, but yet again, going back to Pharaoh, how many times, how many opportunities did he give Pharaoh to just submit? That's all he would have had to have done. His firstborn never had to die. There didn't have to be plagues. None of that had to happen. But he wanted to fight the will of God. And yet God was patient with him. Even in his rebellion, he gave him so many opportunities. He could have destroyed him first time. He was like, oh, you don't want to obey? Done. Didn't have to be his firstborn. It could have literally been him from day one. Like there's nothing stopping God from doing that. And yet he gave him the opportunity. And we see God's glory through it. Which leads us to our next point. In order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory. Okay? Now that's the interesting thing. And yet again, talking about the idea of transforming and evolving. You may have been created broken. You weren't created broken by the Creator. You were created broken because you were born into a broken world. It's like a potter who made something beautiful and wonderful, and he went to put it over to the side, and it fell off the table. But the wonderful thing is you could be born for God's wrath so that he can show the richness of his glory, his mercy. And you can also transition to becoming that new vessel. All of us have. We've given our life to God. We've went into the water. We've come out with a heart of submission to be molded again. Everybody has that opportunity. We all have that free will. Now, there are some people who will never break the mold. There are some people who will never change, who will never see that light, and their life will be a cautionary tale. Pharaoh is the great example that we've been given. And, there are so many others. So it's interesting to see how God doesn't let things be. He is constantly pulling at our hearts. He's constantly wanting us to draw closer to Him and to have a change of heart so that He can remold us into something beautiful, something wonderful, something that will show His glory. And it's ultimately up to us whether we're going to choose to be hardened and be thrown into the kiln. Even us, whom He has called, not from the Jews alone or only, but also from the Gentiles. Now, this would have been like groundbreaking in this era, in this time. The Jews would have been absolutely flabbergasted by this, right? Because they had been led, mostly by their own people, to believe that everybody that wasn't them, the others, the Gentiles, they were never going to be God's people, even though we have example after example after example of how God has brought them into the fold, not just as vessels of wrath, but also as vessels of glory. And it's fascinating because it's also foretold, which we'll get into here in a second. But the reason why this is so groundbreaking, not just for the Jews, if you think about it, because there were a lot of Gentiles at the time that knew the Jews and knew their faith from afar and knew that they were not of the chosen. So the idea that they could be brought into the fold by someone like Paul, who, he was revered. He was known. He wasn't just some random fisher. As an example, just a thought, Not that there's any context there, but he was known, which means his word carried weight. And to imagine that, to have somebody who's of this kind of higher order tell you, who perceivably is not of God's people, that you too can be of God's people. What an amazing thing to hear. As indeed he says in Hosea, "Those who were not my people, I will call my people, and her who was not beloved, I will call beloved." Now, this is prophecy, and the interesting thing about this is the actual reference that in Hosea that's being made is actually not about Gentiles, but Paul is saying that it was. It was a double prophecy, because in the moment, in the time, it was because the Jews of the time were shunned, they were pushed away from God. He had reached his tolerance, and he's like, I am no longer going to help you. You will deal with the sins that you have bore. You will deal with the consequences of your own sins, but I'm stepping away because I will destroy you otherwise. And they were no longer God's people, and yet then they became His people again, because God has a loving and merciful heart. He has far more patience than we deserve. And in the very place where it was said to them, "You are not my people," there they will be called sons of the living God. Yet again, in reference to the Jews of the time and them being kind of exiled is a good word, actually, because that happened who knows how many times. But yeah, God cannot stand to be away from us forever. We think of hell as a terrible thing because of what we understand of it, which is very little. It is a terrifying thing. But imagine how much worse it is for the Father's heart. Even when He knows that He cannot allow you to continue living in the life that you've been living in a way that is shameful, damaging oftentimes, and just disobedient, He keeps coming back. We talk about the imagery of like, you can run away from God, but the moment you turn around, He's right there. And this is that, because God can't stand to be away from us, but He also can't tolerate sin. I can't imagine the difficulty that God has to have in those moments. Like, His heart is just, I want to be near you, but I am just, and you are doing wrong. You are not just harming yourself, you're harming our relationship. You are harming the natural order that I have created for you. I have created this entire world, this entire universe for you. And you want to mess up the order that I've created. I've made this beautiful thing, and you want to participate in its destruction because you don't want to obey me. But I'm sovereign. I know from the beginning to the end, I've seen it all, and yet you still don't want to trust me. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel. This is kind of huge when you think about it. Though the number of the sons of Israel will be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. If that's not terrifying, if that isn't terrifying to you, you might be in the wrong place. We who are temporary see time as this very long, almost inconceivable idea that it could have a beginning and it will eventually have an end. But without delay, God's not waiting around. God's not waiting around to fulfill his purpose, whether that was with Pharaoh, whether that was with Noah, Sodom and Gomorrah, whether that's with Egypt or Babylon or any of the other countless people that God had to put to shame for his glory to be revealed. He's not delaying. He's not dead, which is another idea of some secular philosophers. He's very much alive, and he's not just sitting around doing nothing, which means we shouldn't be sitting around doing nothing. Because if we're sitting around doing nothing, we are waiting for damnation. We're waiting to walk ourselves into that kiln. So what are we doing? How are we living out God's desire, his will? We shouldn't wait. And as Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. Now, I have a couple supporting verses to this, but I think it's interesting because we use the word offspring here, and I think it has a double meaning. Firstly, obviously we know in the several instances where God, pushed his people away and then brought them back, pushed them away, brought them back. It was because their lineage continued. He allowed them to have offspring, which he could have easily stopped. I mean, if he can make someone who's barren have children, he can certainly do the reverse. But secondly, and I think this is the bigger context here, we are the offspring. The Christian sect, as we'll say, of the kind of transition of faith in the lineage of God, is the offspring of Judaism. Our origin is Judaism. Not everybody that was a Jew converted. Not everybody that was a Jew, yet again, as countless as the sand, but only a remnant will be saved. We are that offspring in many ways because of the things that he set up for us. We didn't see it in the moment. We didn't see it until it was all fulfilled through Jesus. That's kind of an amazing thing because we just previously talked about being co-heirs with Jesus. So it's kind of an interesting sibling kind of relationship that we don't realize, and yet we are honored and glorified by God to be able to be a part of his offspring. Not just of the Jews, not in the sense of lineage, but also in the literal sense of being his children. And the wonderful thing is you don't have to be a Jew. You could be a Gentile, as we just previously discussed. But I do have a good example, I think, that kind of fulfills both this last bit and quite a bit of what we've already discussed. So I'm going to bounce back to Exodus 32, 8 through 10. So this was, ultimately this was when they had created the gold calf to worship. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them. They have made for themselves a golden calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." Now, there's a couple interesting things about that. Firstly, so the golden calf incident is humanity as a whole. It's a perfect synopsis in a single event. One, it's reshaping God, right? God is so big we can't comprehend him, we can't put him in our head, so what do? We try to, which is our first problem. Secondly, we're redefining worship. What has God called us to do? What is the worship he has asked of us? Well, it certainly wasn't to bow down before a golden anything. And then thirdly, making a god in their own image, right? This is something we can comprehend. A calf is something we can comprehend. We can't comprehend a being that transcends dimensionality, that transcends time and physical size and shape and matter. So what do? We take what we can see, what we can feel, what we can touch and understand, and we kind of like shape it and then make it into a god, which is silly when you think about it. Instead of the clay submitting to the potter, the clay attempts to create its own potter. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now, it's interesting because leading up to this point, the Israelites have complained a lot, like a lot. And at no point during the complaining did God say, oh, I'm done with you people. Done. They asked, why did you bring us here? What kind of an arrogant question is that? You literally seen all of the miracles that God provided you to get you free. So you complain about the wilderness. Why should we trust you? I mean, I could have let the Red Sea swallow you, but whatever. Was Egypt better? Can you imagine that? Can you imagine genuinely asking yourself whether slavery was better than freedom? Can God really provide? I mean, providing you a way out of slavery, protecting you so that the Egyptians couldn't recapture you. I feel like it would seem so easy to us to want to trust. I say that, not having lived it, and more than likely probably would have had the same struggles because we forget so easily the wonders of God. Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation of you. So there's some interesting things that this small little scripture kind of provides us insight into. Firstly, even covenant people fail. Even witnesses of miracles rebel. Even rescued people sin. We will not be made perfect by the miracles of God. We will only be made perfect when our salvation is complete. When our sanctification and we rejoin with God, that is when we will be perfect. And what a glorious day it will be. That's not to say that those sins aren't still a problem. It's not to say that it still doesn't cause damage, both to your relationship with God, creating that distance, that divide, but also in the sense that, yet again, by sinning, you are disrupting the natural order that God has created. What arrogance we must have. And yet, God preserves a people by mercy, which leads me to a question, which is, why did God preserve anyone at all? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, all it takes is one sin. God could have very easily, at the moment that, Eve's teeth entered the apple, experiment over, done, we're going to start from scratch. But no, he created the greatest love story of all time, which might sound a little cheesy in context, but I mean, to imagine a being, more accurately, that loves us so much to take us from place to place to place, revealing himself over and over and over again, even in ways that we can't fully comprehend. Yet again, all the miracles that it took to get the Israelites out of Egypt. And yet we still struggle with it, even seeing it with our own eyes. Did I? Oh, okay, good. So, kind of to piggyback off of this, I want to go into Numbers 14, 22 through 23. None of the men who have seen my glory and my signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not obeyed my voice, shall see the land that I swore to give to their fathers, and none of those who despise me shall see it. Remember how we talked about offspring? If God had been done with them, there would have been no promise to fulfill anymore. because the people to which he promised, which that is the important thing, is God is always an answer to a promise. There's no promise you can see in the Bible that God has not fulfilled or is currently working on fulfilling, as we know with the prophecies. It was the offspring of the generation that questioned, taunted God that made it into the promised land. Yet again, we are the offspring of the Jews. We carry that promise forward, that salvation that Jesus provides us. We are a new generation of peoples, and we should carry ourselves as such because we have a better understanding, we have a better teacher. We're not looking to Moses and David and Solomon and all these amazing people that came before, though they were amazing because they understood God's heart truly, but their teaching got corrupted. And it became more important about the teaching than it was about the heart, the purpose. God doesn't just call us to be obedient because he finds it fun. He calls it obedient because he knows the consequence. He knows the harm. He wants the relationship. He wants that love. And he can't abide that disobedience. So, being the offspring, being the new generation, how are we going to do things differently? We know God's heart in a different way because we know that it's not about the circumcision, it's about the heart that's circumcised. It's not about following the rules, it's about following God. It's not about our will, it's about his will. The more in tune we get with God, the more we pray to him, we worship him and follow him, the more we're going to want to follow his will. And that's when you know that you've truly been remolded. Pray with me. Father God, I pray that if there's anyone here that has not given their heart to God, that they reach out, they talk to somebody, and we can, set up a time for baptism or prayer or whatever they need in this season. Let us plant seeds. Let us water seeds. Let us harvest. Move us in a way that we can fulfill your glorious plan. I pray that no one in this household is a vessel of destruction, but you have remolded them into a vessel of glory so that we can always point back to you as the source of our truth, the source of our life. I pray these things in Jesus' most powerful name. Amen. Thank you for watching this sermon. If you liked this sermon and you'd like to see similar sermons to it, check out this video here. Also, if you would like more of our content notifications, please subscribe and turn on the bell notification icon. Give us a like so that we can spread the good news of Jesus Christ. Thank you.